President.
Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Late last week, our Democrat colleagues briefly paused their quest to destroy the Senate's 60-vote threshold, just long enough to use the 60-vote threshold themselves to block a bill. Every Republican supported sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that will give Russia even more leverage to bully Europe. Most of our Democratic colleagues bowed to the furious lobbying from the Biden administration to protect Putin's pipeline. There were 55 votes to pass the bill that our friends like Ukrainian President Zelensky desperately wanted passed. But Democrats blocked it by denying 60. Now, many of these same colleagues have spent weeks thundering, literally thundering, that the Senate's 60-vote threshold is an offensive tool of obstruction, a Jim Crow relic, declaring that simple majorities should always get their way. But late last week, they literally wielded the 60-vote threshold themselves, a useful reminder of just how fake the hysteria has been. We already knew Washington Democrats don't have any principled opposition to Senate rules. Democrats repeatedly filibustered the CARES Act in March of 2020 while insisting on changes. Democrats filibustered and killed Senator Tim Scott's police reform bill. You only have to go back a few years to read vigorous defense of the filibuster from our Democratic colleagues and their allies. The Democratic whip, Senator Durbin, put it this way: we need to protect the right of debate in the Senate, preserve checks and balances so that no one party can do whatever it wants. We need to preserve the voice of the minority in America. Dick Durbin, the Democratic leader himself, said in 2017 that we need to, quote, find a way to build a firewall around the legislative filibuster. Build a firewall around the legislative filibuster. And in a letter that same year by 32 Senate Democrats, our colleagues demanded that the 60-vote threshold stay right where it was. So until the last couple of years, senators on both sides have understood the Senate is not here to rubber stamp massive changes by thin majorities. This institution exists to do exactly the opposite, to make sure major laws receive major buy-in and have major staying power. And historically, Democratic allies outside this chamber have recognized this as well. So let's go back about 15 years ago, when Republicans controlled the Senate. A left-wing organization called the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights published a lengthy statement defending the filibuster, including, listen to this, including its relationship to civil rights. So here's what they had to say when Republicans were in the majority here in the Senate. On behalf of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, the nation's oldest, largest, and most diverse civil and human rights coalition, with more than 180 member organizations, we urge you to oppose any efforts to eliminate the 216-year-old filibuster in the United States Senate. That's a coalition of 180 member organizations called the Civil and Human Rights Coalition. They went on. The elimination of the rights of the minority as embodied by the filibuster is contrary to the Founding Fathers' vision of the Senate as a body of equals designed to protect against the tyranny of the majority. The statement continued. The civil rights community has recognized and accepted the value of the filibuster even when it frustrated efforts to advance civil rights legislative goals. During the 1950s and 1960s, countless civil rights bills were filibustered. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not passed until it survived 75 days of the longest filibuster in history, and the Senate voted 71 to 29 to end debate and finally passed the bill. This legislation was enacted because of long, hard work to build support across partisan, ideological, and regional lines. We work to bring Americans together, not to push them farther apart. They conclude, we never demanded the end of the system of checks and balances. In the end, we won the battle by changing votes and not by breaking the rules. These, Mr. President, were left-wing activists writing less than 20 years ago. So let's spell this out. Democrats want the American people to believe the filibuster was not a Jim Crow relic in 2005. Was not even a Jim Crow relic in 2020. Just miraculously became a Jim Crow relic in 2021. Briefly stopped being a Jim Crow relic last Thursday, but it's now back to being a Jim Crow relic this week. Now, to be clear, the partisan election takeover bills that Democrats want to ram through this week are not in any way successors of the civil rights legislation from the mid-20th century. It has been, is today, and will remain illegal to discriminate against voters anywhere in America because of their race. Period. That's the law. Now, targeting Americans' online speech and sending government money to political campaigns is not about civil rights, it's about tilting the playing field. Weakening widely popular voter ID laws and making it harder to produce accurate voter rolls is not about making voting easier, it's about making cheating easier. Changing the law so that our partisan attorney general can rewrite voting laws without even having to win in court is not about promoting justice. It's about short-circuiting justice. This is about one party wanting the power to unilaterally rewrite the rule book of American elections. Now, interestingly, the Biden administration staff have gone out of their way lately to highlight my long, strong record on real civil rights and real voting rights. The President's secretary explained that I have, quote, a pretty strong record of supporting voting rights. She's right about that. And that's exactly why I have no patience, none, for the unrelated partisan takeover that some Democrats are trying to rebrand with that banner. The Democratic leader argues that his proposed elections takeover and his efforts to break the Senate are last resorts because of new state laws that passed in 2021. He says it's irrelevant that 2020 saw record turnout, and listen to this, 94% said voting was easy because this debate is exclusively about what happened in 2021. But Democrats have been pushing these same policy charges and the same chicken little rhetoric since 2019, a year and a half before the 2020 election, which Democrats now call a high turnout success. The Democratic leader gave an interview claiming that evil Republicans are trying to attack voting and disenfranchise people. Of course, when Democrats went on to win the White House, the 2020 election went from presumptively illegitimate to exemplary and unquestionable overnight. Around the same time, mid-2019, Senator Schumer began floating a nuclear attack on Senate rules. It's completely untethered from the elections issue. He just thought breaking the rules would make for a livelier stint as majority leader. Washington Democrats have wanted the power to rewrite the rules for political speech and election laws long before the events that are supposed to justify it. and the Democratic leader's effort to break the Senate long predates the latest pretext. We have strong disagreements about the substance of these bills, but even more broadly, we see decreasing trust in our democracy among both political sides. We have a sitting president of the United States shouting that United States senators are on the side of Bull Connor and Jefferson Davis for refusing to shatter the Senate. Was the Senate created to make these kinds of factional fevers worse, or to help break the fevers? Does the Senate exist to help narrow majorities double down on divisions, or to force broad coalitions to build bridges? This fake hysteria does not prove the Senate is obsolete. It proves the Senate is as necessary as ever. Republicans have supported this limitation on the majority's power, both when we've been in the minority, which these rules protect, and when we've been the majority, which they inconvenience. And last week, some of our colleagues across the aisle reconfirmed they have the courage and the principle to keep their word and to protect the institution as well. But too many of our colleagues across the aisle still want to respond to a 50-50 Senate with a rule-breaking power grab. Voting to break this institution will not be a free vote or a harmless action, even if their effort fails. An unprincipled attempt at grabbing power is not harmless just because it fails. Voting to break the Senate is not cost-free just because a bipartisan majority of your colleagues have the wisdom to stop you. It's amazing that our colleagues are this enthralled to radical activists. We have inflation, a pandemic, rampant violent crime, a border crisis, and possibly a war on the European continent. But rather than work on any of that, Senate Democrats want to mar their own legacies with a reckless procedural vote they know will fail. A faction this desperate for unlimited short-term power is a faction that must be denied it.
Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I care about the future of this institution, but right now I care more about the future of our democracy. Our country has been the bedrock for democracies around the world. It has been the gold standard by which other countries wishing to achieve transparency and validation of their governments have asked us to come and witness their elections. Let's not forget what is great about a democracy. The power rests with the people. And when you have an election, it's the people who have spoken. So whether it was FDR in the New Deal or Ronald Reagan declaring mourning in America, the people had spoken and the country went about the change that was implemented because of free and fair elections. Trust me, there are countries who are jealous of this. They obviously run their countries by other means. They are less stable and they are less egalitarian. And yet, if we think of the many great advantages of a democracy, nothing says it better than the people have spoken. Yet now, we have a former president of the United States, Donald Trump, who has dared to say and continues to say, the people haven't spoken. Donald Trump is not just like the guy at a football game who doesn't like the referee's calls. Donald Trump has taken it to a whole new level of basically, without evidence, saying his team didn't lose the game. Can you imagine NFL or college football structure where the coach says, I don't like the ref's call, my team didn't lose the game. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time going marching around to every football game and every community saying, my team didn't lose the game. Well, thank God college and professional coaches know better. They don't do this. And yet, former President Trump keeps saying, I don't like the call of election officials, judges, federal courts. Never mind, there were 60 decisions by different courts. I'm going to protest the outcome of this election. Never in the history of our country do I know a major race where someone declared they really didn't lose. What if everybody went around saying, I really didn't lose? What if our system of governments would be affected by that? Well, Madam President, it is getting to that level of absurdity. The Republican nominee in the 2020 Washington gubernatorial election lost by over 600,000 votes, yet he claimed voter fraud. He lost by 56 to 43, and even though he lost by such a huge margin, he claimed voter fraud. He sued the Secretary of State, who happened to be a Republican, in King County Superior Court. He only dropped the election fraud lawsuit after the court threatened his lawyer with making meritless claims. Do we really understand this danger? The danger of people in our country, to our economy, to our way of life, if these falsehoods continue? We're not here, though, just because a former president cannot accept an election loss. He began sowing these seeds of distrust into our election system the minute he stepped onto the national stage. We're here because the problem has become so serious that people are now trying to disenfranchise the voting rights of our fellow Americans. Some voter suppression tactics are being put in place because some believe the former president did not like the outcome of the election. I want to be clear, there are people on both sides of the aisle that do believe in free and fair elections. There are Republicans in key election positions who stood up to the illegal tactics of the president when he tried to change the outcome of the last election. But what our country can't afford right now is the continuation of Trumpthink to allow to erode the voting rights of our fellow Americans. Voting rights have been hard fought and hard won. I know the president presiding understands this. First by women in 1920, then later protecting minority groups in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. In 1970, we updated it, making standards, helping to regulate presidential elections. In 75, saying we had to protect other minorities. Both sides of the aisle agreed to this. And in 1992, we expanded for bilingual education requirements. That passed with 75 to 20 votes. And again, in 2006, the last time the voting rights was updated, we were in a similar situation. The Supreme Court had had 2 cases and struck down part of the act, and we all came together to renew and reaffirm the constitutional protections for people in the United States of America. It passed 98-0. There is nothing wrong with the John Lewis voting rights law before us. There's nothing wrong with the John Lewis voting rights law before us. It is a bill with bipartisan support that tries to maintain, I think, a federal minimum assurance that states don't suppress the rights of our fellow Americans. When Martin Luther King was fighting this fight, he said, "One man, one vote." He knew that this was about making sure that everybody had a chance to vote. The John Lewis Act is a continuation of those rights and upgrading something that has been upgraded numerous times since 1965. And that is why my colleagues, Senator Manchin and Murkowski, called for bipartisan reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. Bipartisan call for reauthorization last spring of the Voting Rights Act. They said, quote, "Inaction is not an option," end quote. They continued to say, quote, "Congress must come together just as we have done in the past, time and time again, to reaffirm our long-standing bipartisan commitment to free, accessible, and secure elections." And that is what we must do now. That is why there are 150 businesses who support the John Lewis Act. Companies like Microsoft and Google and Intel and Pepsi and Tesla, Sealaska, Target, PayPal. These are companies who know and understand they want to do business in a democracy. As Tim Cook said, the right to vote is fundamental to our democracy. American history is a story of expanding the right to vote to all citizens. And Black people in particular have had to march, struggle, and even give their lives for more than a century to defend that right. And we support efforts to ensure that our democracy and our future is more hopeful and inclusive than the past. There are others. Best Buy: "An election cannot be free or fair if every eligible voter is not given a full chance to vote, or if the law makes it harder to do so." Now, Madam President, I disagree with my colleague who was just on the floor, because there is a lot of demeaning of the system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now because I have another segment here on the floor later. But I come from a vote-by-mail state, and I am proud of what our state has accomplished. So I do not appreciate the disinformation of Newt Gingrich when he says, quote, "The biggest way to expand voter fraud is to expand vote-by-mail." He's wrong. If I could slash a red line and a red circle through this now, Madam President, I would do so. But I will spend many minutes later on the floor talking to people why vote by mail is part of the solution and not the threat that he thinks it is. Companies know that when it comes to our economy, we're greatly aided by being in a democracy. And that is why they don't want it eroded. It will cost us if we're a less stable place to do business. So why now do people refuse to engage on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? You know, I might be one of those people who would say, don't change the filibuster rule, we can wait. Wait. Wait for what? What are we waiting for? Our Capitol was attacked. We were attacked. People defending us were killed. For what? For what? A big lie. A big lie about our election. I sat outside the Capitol on January 6th and listened to the president telling these lies I knew weren't true. I knew what he said wasn't correct about our voting laws because I know and understand them, and I certainly know vote by mail. But he said many lies that now many court decisions have all said are not true. But the point is that Donald Trump and his followers keep following, and they tell the people the election wasn't fairly decided. And now they're trying to pass state laws eroding our constitutional rights to protect every American's ability to vote. And some here don't want to act. Our democracy is under threat, and people are trying to undermine the credibility of our elections, and you don't want to act. Trump supporters are literally trying to hoist a Jolly Roger flag over our democracy because they lost the election, and some people don't want to act. Some percentage of the Republican Party now believe that the election was wrongly decided, and some people don't want to act. Madam President, we have to have faith in close elections, and the best way to do that is not to suppress the vote, but encourage and empower more people to vote in a safe and secure manner. We need to believe in our voting system, not believe that we can undermine it. Democracies don't grow on trees. They need to be protected. They need to be defended. They need to be fought for. And with all the challenges we're facing, COVID, a changing economy in an information age, global migration, climate change, I'm getting too many questions from my constituents about whether we're becoming a fascist nation. Why am I answering those questions? Because Trump told a big lie and he got people to attack our Capitol, and now he's ramping up fear and anxiety to the point where locals are changing their election laws and eroding our democracy? No, I can't stand by. I will vote to proceed and change. I will not stand by because my parents taught me better. My father fought in World War II and reminded me constantly when I was growing up that if someone's rights were eroded, you better stand up, because if you don't, they're coming after your rights next. And a threat to one was a threat to all. My mom worked at the polls on Election Day. When she was a child, she played in her backyard and met an African-American woman who became her friend. When Election Day rolled around, my mom noticed that her friend had to wait outside in the cold to vote, where the white voters got to go inside and wait. My mom took her friend by the hand inside the polling place and said, "My friend's not waiting outside." It earned my mom the nickname Little Eleanor, after the First Lady of the period. What might seem surprising is how much my mom liked her fellow Republican precinct committeemen. She felt like they were on the same team, team democracy, people who got the vote out. They may not agree on who they were voting for, but they agreed people should vote, and they were willing to live with the consequences. And believe me, my parents had a lot of things that they had to keep fighting for, but they believed in democracy. I remember my mom saying how uneasy she felt when she realized her friends and neighbors, seeing the results of her precinct, didn't support John Kennedy for President of the United States. My parents were crushed when John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were all assassinated. But they never lost faith in the system, and they never said the system was rigged. What we need to do now is to protect our democracy. We need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need to say, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, that one man, one vote is what our country stands for, and it is the strength of our nation. One thing about January 6th bothers me the most. It bothers me the most because I think about my father and his brother. My father quit high school to fight in World War II because his brother was already missing or in a POW camp. He knew he had to join the fight against the oppressions, the tyranny, the fascism that existed. He knew he had to join the fight to uphold the democracy of the United States. This is a picture of what it looked like to be escorted back into this chamber on January 6th. All I could think of when I saw this picture is obviously, yes, support and gratitude for the military who supported us. But all I could think about was my father and his brother who fought in World War II for these rights to uphold a democracy so that I could stand for election and that my friends and neighbors could vote for me. And then I would come here in an environment where I was free to walk into the Capitol at any moment and cast a vote on behalf of the people that I represent. And yet, on one fateful day, that all changed. And we were no different than some other country who had to use military force to support our democracy here in voting. Madam President, that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not what we're fighting for. Many Americans have fought to uphold the democracies of our nation. The least we could do is pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The least we could do is work in a mission together to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and show that our country believes in holding these important values of a democracy as utmost important. Let's vote to get this done. Let's move forward to show our country we believe in voting rights in the United States Senate. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Democrats have shamelessly alleged that a massive federal takeover of elections is needed because of questions some Republicans raised after the 2020 election. So I come to the floor today to show that this whole argument predates the 2020 election. This Democrat reasoning is despite the fact that their proposal predates the 2020 election. The bill that they want us to pass is a product of concerns that the Democrats had about the 2016 election being stolen from Hillary Clinton, also because of the 2018 elections. And in fact, the Democrat proposal was designed specifically to double down on false claims that Democrats lost certain elections in 2018 only because of rigged elections. I've said it before, and I want to say it again. Evidence-free claims of voter suppression are as bad as election-free claims of voter fraud. Both voter fraud and discrimination in voting is illegal. Any claim of voter fraud or violation of voting rights should be resolved in our independent court system with evidence that can stand up in the courts. And as I've mentioned before, the claims by some Trump supporters that certain brand of voting machines switched votes was lifted entirely from the Democrats' 2004 playbook, and you may remember that Democrat House members challenged the electoral vote count of whether George W. Bush was officially and honestly reelected. And President Trump's questioning of his loss in Georgia was simply following in the footsteps of the losing Democrat candidate for governor of that state just 2 years before, who lost a much bigger margin and never admitted that defeat. That makes me wonder if Democrats' professed outrage comes from a sincere concern for democratic reforms, or if they're just upset that President Trump stole their playbook. If Democrats really want to preserve democratic norms, they would not be proposing a federal government overturning the current electoral process in all 50 states on purely partisan basis with no attempt to even hear out Republicans' legitimate concerns. The bills that we're talking about this week are being called democracy reform. Does democracy need reform? I support the American democratic system. It does not need a fundamental rewrite. 240-year history of our great country under this Constitution ought to support that. It works, and it deserves our support. We should not denigrate American democracy for short-term political gain. President Trump's candidacy in 2016 brought many Americans to the polls who had not voted recently, and there was a record turnout. In 2020, turnout broke the record yet again, both for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and President Biden won that election. In the 2021 election, there were unusually high turnouts for off-year elections to the benefit of Republicans and conservatives. You saw that, particularly in the state of Virginia, where the Republican candidates statewide were victorious, and you saw some surprising turnouts of opposition to Democrats that were reelected in the state of New Jersey. Democrats accused Republicans of wanting to keep people from voting. Why would we want to keep people from voting when we have been very successful in many large turnout elections very recently? Plus, have you seen the polls today that shows dissatisfaction with Democrats, a Republican deficit of 5 or 7 points last year, with a positive Republican versus Democrat polls this year? So we ought to stop casting doubt about American elections. Stop casting aspersions on common sense election security measures like ID supported by overwhelming numbers of Americans of all backgrounds. And by all backgrounds, I mean even people that we classify as minorities. let's work together to boost the confidence of all Americans in our elections. Let's start rejecting claims. That only way that the other party can win is by rigging elections. Let's retire the short-term strategy of falsely claiming that one of the two parties is a threat to democracy. That in and of itself is a very undemocratic position to take. This kind of rhetoric damages civil society and erodes faith in our democracy. For the sake of our country, please stop it. When Democrats last had the majority and proposed blowing up the Senate rules and the historic way that the Senate has worked, I gave a series of speeches explaining how the father of the Constitution, James Madison, intended for the Senate to be a deliberative body. In other words, a break on the hot passions that occur in the House of Representatives. I repeated my deeply held opposition to gutting the Senate process, even when my party took control of all three branches, and it would have been politically expedient in the short term. I don't know how many times President Trump brought up doing away with what we call the filibuster, or the 60-vote requirement. It was even followed by a lot of our Republican Party grassroots wanting to overcome Democrats' use of the cloture rule to block the Republican agenda during those 4 years. But I spoke out strongly against it in 2017. Over half of the current Democrat senators signed a letter calling for preservation of the current rules requiring a 60 votes to stop debate, for considering the legislation despite the use of nuclear option for nominees. I agree with President Biden's position in 2005, reflecting on the same understanding that I have of the Constitution and the role of the Senate as envisioned by James Madison. Then Senator Biden said this, quote, "That's the reason we have the rule. So when one party controls all levers of government, one man or woman can't stand on the floor of the Senate and resist the passions of the moment," end of quote. Even Senator Schumer, the majority leader, said at that time, gutting the cloture rule would be a quote-unquote doomsday for democracy. Doomsday for democracy. Now it seems like Senator Schumer invites that doomsday. Senator Durbin hit the nail on the head as recently as 2018, saying, quote, it would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers, end of quote. I agreed then, and I agree now. Now the shoe is on the other foot, and Democrats have changed their position. Many, not for the first time. Senator Durbin has now joined the crusade of his Democratic predecessor, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, famous for debating Abraham Lincoln on the issues of slavery. But that Douglas from Illinois also proposed a Senate rule allowing a narrow majority to vote a final vote on bills. Hypocrisy is not rare in politics, on both sides of the aisle. But the fact that Democrats switch principles on such a consequential matter whenever Senate control changes from one party to the other is particularly glaring. the party of Jim Crow, which made liberal use of so-called filibuster just over a year ago to block Republicans' agendas, are now saying falsely it's a relic of Jim Crow. I do not see how they can look the voters in the eyes with no sign of embarrassment. I do not understand why the policemen of our governmental system, the media, isn't roasting them for this hypocritical power grab. I would now like to address a misconception on the cloture motion, the 60-vote requirement. The cloture motion requires 60 votes to bring consideration of legislation to finality. Just because it can be used to block legislation does not mean that the term cloture always equals a filibuster. Cloture cuts off not just debate, but the offering of amendments. Voting for cloture also is saying that the Senate has voted on enough amendments. Senators who have amendments important to their state that they want to offer should be voting against cloture to preserve their right to offer amendments as their constituents might desire. Debate and amendments are the hallmark of this democracy, not an obstacle to be swept aside in pursuit of short-term partisan agenda. When Democrats last controlled the Senate with 60 votes, and thereafter, amendment votes became very rare. Even rank-and-file Democrats lost opportunities to represent their states with amendments important to that state. Let's look at the cloture issue another way. Also, many people confuse debate over filibuster with talking nonstop to delay. That's a kind of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington filibuster, the famous movie, you know. This has nothing to do with cloture. People who talk about returning to the so-called talking filibuster are confusing two different Senate rules, both called filibuster. Senators have never had to talk until they drop from exhaustion to preserve their right to amend bills, so the talking filibuster rhetoric is nonsense. Democrats have convinced themselves, or at least their activist face, and done it falsely, that our democracy is in crisis, and so it is absurd to say only one party, unilateral governments, can save democracy. But once an exception is made, and they're talking about that exception just for this voting rights bill, but once an exception is made to the right of all senators to debate and to amend legislation, there seems to be no going back. You learned that. Democrats learned that in 2013 when they abolished the 60-vote requirement on district and circuit court judges, and they lived to regret it 4 years later when Republicans did the same thing when we had a Supreme Court justice up. It's a slippery slope that you should not let come about. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa yield to a question.
I'm not very good at yielding, but I'll try what I can.
Thank you very much. First, thank you for coming to the floor to debate such an important issue as how to make the Senate work well as a deliberative body and how to make our country work well. But I was struck by a couple of things that you mentioned, and that is that you had stood strong fast against striking down the filibuster, and you noted how consistent you were, but you also criticized Democrats for changing position. But can you help my memory out on this? Because did you not vote to strike down the filibuster on Supreme Court nominations?
Yes, I did.
So you changed your position as well, you would concede, since previously you had opposed getting rid of the filibuster.
The answer is yes, but remember what I said, and I just said it, so you obviously heard me, that we warned in 2013 when I think all Republicans voted against reducing the 60 vote down for district court and circuit court judges so you could pack the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, that you'd regret that. And you have regretted it because Republicans were saying in 2017, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and we voted to reduce it then for a Supreme Court justice. And now I'm sure that from your point of view, you have a Supreme Court that's not very favorable to what you think a Supreme Court ought to be doing with the 3 people that Trump put on there. So that's where I'm coming from.
Well, I do appreciate your response, and it's so rare we actually have any sort of dialogue on the floor of the Senate. It's one of the things we've lost. I do recall in that moment that for over a year we had working groups trying to resolve the extraordinary new level of cloture motions on President Obama's nominations. It concluded in a meeting in the old Senate chamber where the agreement was reached to stop doing that. And then, as you point out, Mitch McConnell came to the floor and he said, it doesn't matter the quality of the individual who is nominated, I will not let any judge be considered for these 3 vacancies. That is a completely unprecedented new element that was brought in to bear on that particular conversation. So to just kind of illuminate some of the details that were left out. I was also struck by another thing you said, which is that the filibuster is not a relic of Jim Crow. And I was struck about that because from 1891 through 1965, so we are talking over 80 years, the only thing that was blocked in the U.S. Senate by filibuster was civil rights for Black Americans. Given that, wouldn't you say it's fair for us to say that the filibuster in that history was indeed a relic of Jim Crow?
You know who controlled the Senate during that period of time on the issue you brought up, and it's the Democrats, senators from the South. And remember that when the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was passed, that there was a higher percentage of Republicans than Democrats that voted for it. And the one person that made a difference in getting the Civil Rights Act passed was Senator Dirksen, the Republican leader. Now, I'm going to have to end this discussion with you but I want to say one thing. Why would you want to expand this precedent that's set by Democrats into legislation and weaken bipartisanship? That's where you got to leave it. It's a slippery slope. You may want to do it just for a Voting Rights Act, but it's going to go further.
Thank you for your responding to my questions. I appreciate that. Mr. President.
The senator from Oregon.
I think I'll start just by returning to the 1800s. And a senator from Massachusetts, Senator Sumner. Now, Senator Sumner later played a key role in civil rights debates, which is why I'm returning that story, and it's a story about the Senate floor. Sumner gave a speech about Kansas being admitted into the Union, and he was a Republican senator who called out 2 Democratic senators, insulting one of them, and a representative from the House of Representatives on the other end of this corridor came over here. His name was Preston Brooks, and he took considerable offense. And he proceeded to come to the Senate floor and cane Senator Sumner. And Senator Sumner was gravely injured. But he did recovering slowly, served for another 18 years, which leads me to the fact that he proceeded to put forward civil rights legislation in 1875. And 1875, 150 years ago, almost 150 years ago, 145 years ago. And so he argued after the Civil War that our black Americans were being discriminated against, and it needed to end. That anyone should go into any public accommodation and be treated equally here in the United States of America. A constitution that says all men, and let's include women, are created equally. So he put forward this bill, and it said that every person gets equal access to theaters, to public schools, to churches, to cemeteries, equal opportunity to serve in jury duty, and that any suits brought in this regard would be tried in federal court, not state court, so we could enforce a federal standard of non-discrimination across this land. Now, Sumner died of a heart attack in 1874. So he had put forward this originally as an amendment, actually an introduction in 1870, a bill, and he died before it could be passed. And as he was dying, he pleaded to Frederick Douglass and others at his bedside, "You must take care of my civil rights bill." And in the months following his death, the Senate did act. And they supported that bill, and it was passed into law in 1875. At that moment, it would be hard to envision that after I was born, we would still be fighting for equal access to public accommodations. The Senate passed that bill, and it made it into law in 1875. But the Supreme Court of the United States struck down that law 8 years later. Boom. Equal access in America, supported by the elected representatives of the House and the Senate, was blown to smithereens by a Supreme Court of the United States of America. Well, that did set stage for another civil rights battle, and it was 1890. It was after Benjamin Harrison's successful presidential campaign, in which he promised election reform, election integrity. Because you see, anyone looking at our republic would know that we are all affected, no matter what state we come from, by the integrity of the elections in the other states. There has to be integrity of all of them for this U.S. Senate to have integrity. There has to be integrity in all of the state elections for that House of Representatives down the hall to have integrity. So, Benjamin Harris was elected, campaigning on this type of reform. And there was a senator, Senator George Hoar, who championed an amendment or an attempt to bolster national protections for federal elections. It was particularly targeted at stopping voter suppression that had really arisen in the southern part of the United States following the Civil War. So this bill, known commonly as the Lodge Bill, also known as the Federal Elections Bill, it passed the House of Representatives in 1890. And what did this bill do? It allowed citizens from any district to petition a federal circuit court to appoint federal supervisors for congressional elections in case of efforts to suppress the vote by local officials. It permitted the federal government to appoint supervisors to oversee all phases of federal election, including voter registration and certification of election results, to make sure there were no shenanigans at the state level that would corrupt the core vision of equal representation, the core foundation of integrity in elections. It is the foundation of the vision of the legitimacy and the production of government of, by, and for the people. And this bill even enabled federal election supervisors to request deputy U.S. marshals as necessary to protect the ballot box for every citizen to have access. And it passed the House of Representatives. And it came here to the Senate, and it failed because they couldn't get unanimous consent to close debate. At that time, there was no cloture motion. The senators in 1805 have gotten rid of the prior question rule, which would have allowed debate to be closed, because they had a social contract. That social contract was that we listen to everyone to get their perspectives. People can speak not once but twice on a question. They can speak for as long as we're going to listen to everyone, and then we take a vote. That was the social contract. But this filibuster broke that social contract because everyone was listened to, but you couldn't get unanimous consent to close debate. And so the bill died. It had the support of the people of the United States of America through their elected representatives down the hall. It had the support of this Senate to protect the fundamental right to vote in our nation by the majority of this body here, the U.S. Senate. But the social contract was broken to block black Americans from voting, to allow states and local election officials to rig the registration system so you could never sign up, to allow intimidators to gather at the polls to keep black Americans from getting through them to put their ballot in the box. You know, I'd like to say that all traces of inequality in voting are gone from America. I'd like to say that. And indeed, that was reasonably true through recent years before the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, because any changes in your voting rules had to be pre-approved in states that had engaged in these intimidating practices. I'd say reasonably true, because the real fact is there was still a significant blemish in our elections. And that is, on election day, in certain states and certain precincts, there was a game being played to make it harder for some citizens to vote than other citizens to vote. And the game worked like this. If you have an area where you want low turnout, you proceed to create a big precinct so that there's a lot of people who have to go to that one place to vote. And if you have a desire to encourage the people in another precinct to vote, a white precinct, you create smaller precincts so the voting line won't be as long. And then there were other tricks, like, for example, understaffing the voting precinct where it's predominantly black Americans to make it harder for them to vote, and making sure you staff really well the precinct where you want the white Americans to vote. And there were other tricks as well. For example, relocating the voting location in the black precinct so that people go to the wrong place. Or putting it where parking is virtually impossible, so it's much harder to get to the poll. Or putting out false information about the date and the location of the voting. These things are all wrong. Voter suppression exists today. And it was powerful to see how a couple tools have greatly reduced those tricks and traps. One of those tools is early voting. If you have an early voting period, it's hard to create long lines. It's hard to sustain wrong information about where to go. It's very difficult to deny people the ability to vote simply by having too few staffers. Even more so, vote by mail is powerful. Now, we have Republican states like Utah that have vote by mail, and they love it, and it elects Republicans. And you have more blue states like Oregon that have vote by mail, and they love it, and that's my home state. And I was really struck when I was first running for the Oregon State Legislature. Was 1998. And we still voted at the precincts voting polls, except the Republican Party had said we can increase turnout if we get all the Republicans to sign up for absentee ballots. And so they got a high percent of Republicans to sign up for absentee ballots. And then the Democrats said, well, okay, yeah, we can get Democrats to sign up for absentee ballots. And so 50% of the electorate in 1998 in Oregon was voting by mail and 50% at the polls. And as I went door to door on my first race for the Oregon House and asked people what they liked and what they didn't like, they normally said, what I really hate is that we have too many potholes. I'm not happy with City Hall. And what I really like is my absentee ballot. And I'd say, well, why is that? And they said, well, you know, I don't have to worry about where to park, and I don't have to worry about long lines. And you know what else? It's a complicated set of issues under an initiative system we have in Oregon, and I like to be able to sit at my table, study them, discuss them with my spouse, have my children come to the table and see what we're doing. Well, these two tools really opened the doors to the election process in the last election. And the response of my Republican colleagues was, oh no, we can't let that happen. We don't want those people to vote. We better rein in vote by mail. We better rein in voter registration. Georgia got rid of voter registration in between the main election and the runoff because 70,000 plus Georgians registered during that period, and they think it helped Democrats more than Republicans. So in a prejudicial way, they said, let's make registration harder. Well, it's not acceptable in our country to erect barriers for targeted communities. Not for Black Americans, not for Hispanic Americans, not for college students, not for young voters, and not for Native American reservations, not for anyone. But why are those groups being targeted in a surgical way by the strategies in state after state after state with Republican legislatures and Republican governors? Because those constituencies tend to vote more often for Democrats than Republicans. So they are stealing the vote of millions of Americans. They are corrupting the election process for millions of Americans. And we stand here today in the Senate with the same issue that we were debating in 1890 and 91. The House said set national standards so every American can vote, and the Senate would not give unanimous consent to get to a final vote, and contributed to 8+ decades of discrimination in our country, of corrupted elections in our country, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I see a colleague here preparing to speak, and I haven't even begun my real speech yet, but I'm going to close to hand the floor to him, my colleague from Maryland. But let me summarize a couple points before I do so. I believe the Senate is far better off when the minority has the power to slow things down. I think that that is value to be able to have leverage to get amendments, to be able to negotiate a compromise, to be able to make sure a technical bill has been examined by experts and you understand what it really does, to make sure we've seen all the provisions, to make sure the public's seen all the provisions, to make sure the press has been able to investigate the provisions. All of that's incredibly positive. And it's why, whether I've been in the minority or been in the majority, I have argued we need to sustain 60 votes to close debate. And I still hold that position now, 60 votes to close debate by a vote. There have traditionally been 4 ways that a debate on the floor comes to a conclusion. The first is a break in the debate. At that point, I was struck when I asked the experts, is the chair allowed to call the question? And I was told not only can they call the question, they have the responsibility to call the question when there's a break in the debate. So a break in the debate is one. The second is by unanimous consent. Everyone agrees, we've been at this long enough, let's do 4 more amendments and then go to final passage. And there's a unanimous consent agreement to do that. And we still do that quite often. The third is to have a vote on closing debate, and we have to get 60 votes. It's not a ratio of those who show up to vote. So the irony is those who want to debate often don't show up. You can have a vote 59-5 and the 59 lose. You have to get 60 votes. So the problem, and the fourth is Rule 19, which says every senator gets to speak twice. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's never been a debate in the U.S. Senate that was finally brought to a close by everyone using up their 2 speeches. But it always hovers there, saying there is an eventual ability to vote on the question. These are the 4 traditional strategies. We need to apply those 4 strategies to a period of debate addressing final passage of the bill. The cloture motion would still be there. The possibility of a UC would still be there. A break in the debate would still be a break in the debate, and a UC would be UC. All 4 tools would still be there, but we'd be addressing final passage. Because the problem we have, the little kind of behind-the-scenes complexity of Senate rules, is that in the modern Senate, there is always a pending amendment. So you can't actually get to final passage unless you have a period of debate dedicated to final passage. A break in the debate would call the question on the amendment, not final passage. This means that those who want more debate could hold the floor for weeks and weeks on something they are determined to keep presenting to the American public. But it brings in the public. It brings in the public. They can weigh in on whether we are heroes or whether we're bums. They can weigh in on amendments we say we're going to bring up the next day. They can help us understand how folks back home feel. There is no public in the no-show, no-effort, invisible filibuster that we have had since 1975. There's no public. And there are no amendments, because amendments require supermajority closed debate, and someone says, well, my amendment, I'm not going to agree to that until my amendment gets up. There's no longer a social contract that you do your amendment, I'll do my amendment, we'll all do them, they'll all be on topic, it's gone. And so the number of amendments has dropped tenfold between the 109th Congress and the 116th Congress. The number of amendments dropped more than tenfold over that time period. Instead, the floor managers negotiate, the leaders negotiate, they produce a list and then ask everyone to agree to that list, and someone objects. You left out my amendment. So we, a room full of former House members and industry leaders, former governors, former speakers of their state House or presidents of their state Senate, all this talent sitting around here, people who have engaged in complexes, do nothing day after day after day while the invisible no-show, no-effort filibuster destroys debate in the Senate of the United States of America. It is our responsibility to restore debate to this chamber, to restore amendments. So the advantages of the restoration are, number one, that you have amendments. Number two, that you have public debate. And number three, perhaps most important, you have an incentive for both sides to negotiate. Because under the no-show, no-effort, invisible filibuster that we've had since 1975, the minority of either side says, you know, if I can get 41 of our minority members to agree not to close debate, and all they have to do is not even show up to vote, or show up to vote if they like, but vote no, then the majority can never get anything done. And won't that enhance our political power in the minority party? That's an almost irresistible temptation in the tribal partisan warfare of today. So each minority is tempted into basically exercising a veto over the majority party's policy agenda. That is an eye for an eye, makes the whole world blind strategy. The Democrats sabotage the Republican majority. The Republicans sabotage the Democratic majority. But under the public filibuster, not only is the public involved, but the minority has to maintain continuous debate, which can be hard, so they have an incentive to negotiate. And the majority, seeing the time burned up that they need for other things, other policy bills and nominations, they have an incentive to negotiate. So you get amendments, you get the public involved, and most important, you recreate an incentive to negotiate. That is the reinvigorated filibuster strategy, the talking filibuster, or call it the public filibuster, or just call it extended debate on final passage of the bill. Whatever you call it, it is better than the paralysis and partisanship that are destroying the Senate's ability to address the questions that face this nation. And there is no more important question than defending the right of every citizen to vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking our colleague, the senator from Oregon, Senator Merkley, for his leadership in working to restore the functioning of the Senate and to protect our democracy. And we need both, and we need them now. Mr. President, it was just 12 days ago that we marked the one-year anniversary of the January 6th attack on this Capitol and on our democracy itself. It was a violent attempt to stop Congress from certifying the presidential election of Joe Biden and to overturn the decision of the American people. And it was inspired and instigated by the former president. And while that assault did not succeed in stopping us from counting the vote that day, the big lie did not die. In fact, the big lie has metastasized, it has spread, and its poison is seeping across the country. It is now taking the form of Republican-controlled state legislatures enacting laws that erect new barriers to the ballot box. And let's be clear, they are erecting barriers specifically designed to make it harder for people of color and younger voters to cast their ballots. As we saw in a federal circuit court case a number of years ago with respect to North Carolina, the court found that the state legislature had targeted African-American voters with surgical precision. Dr. King observed that voting is, quote, the foundation stone for political action. And he also observed that when the right to vote is impeded, a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition are betrayed. And what we see happening in state legislatures are not just efforts to put up barriers to the ballot box. They're also passing laws to authorize partisan operatives to interfere in the counting of the votes, and even to overturn the result after the count. So laws to interfere with the casting of the votes and laws to interfere with the counting of the votes. That's what's happening right now and 19 legislatures around the country have already enacted these kinds of laws. So, Mr. President, yes, our democracy was under attack right here on January 6th of last year. But 1 year later, the evidence is clear. The big lie is alive, and our democracy is still under attack. It's under attack by those seeking to implement the big lie in state legislatures. It's just the venue that has changed. When we reconvened here after the attacks of January 6th, I said on this floor that what we witnessed is what happens when we don't stand up together as Democrats and Republicans to confront the big lie. Now, over a year later, we have another chance to stand up together. To meet this moment and to protect our democracy, we need to take action here and now. That's what the Freedom to Vote Act does. It establishes minimum standards to ensure equal access to the ballot box across the country. It guards against partisan election meddling. It ends gerrymandering nationwide, and it ends secret money in elections. And it contains the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore the protections guaranteed in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's what it does. And, Mr. President, we are well within our rights as federal lawmakers to write and pass these bills. The relevant portion of Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution, I have that here, clearly states the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. The Constitution specifically empowers us to pass these laws to protect voting. So enough of the specious argument I've heard so many times here on the Senate floor that these bills somehow represent an unconstitutional power grab. Far from it, the framers expressly empower the Congress to protect federal elections. Now, all 50 members of the Democratic majority, the Democratic caucus, support these bills to protect our democracy. I'm disappointed that as of this moment, not one member of the Senate Republican caucus plans to join us. In fact, we know that there are 16 Republican senators here today who voted in 2006 to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Today, not a single Republican senator will stand up and support these bills. Mr. President, that's a very sad and bad sign of this moment in our history. I accept that each and every senator has the right to cast their vote on bills however they choose. That's the way democracy works. But what is happening now is very different. Republican senators are using the current version of the Senate rules to block a vote on these vital measures to protect our democracy, to prevent this body from having a final vote on the Freedom to Vote legislation and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Enhancement Act. So, Mr. President, let's step back and look at how the current version of the Senate rules operate in practice. And I say current rules because the Senate rules have evolved over time, as our colleague from Oregon has mentioned. They have taken many twists and turns over the years. And in their current form and practice, they have departed radically from their original purpose and design. Today, with some exceptions, 41 out of 100 senators can block the other 59 from voting on legislation that's important to the American people. Over the last year, this Senate rule has been used to block bills that enact common sense gun safety provisions, provide for equal pay for equal work, and many other bills have been blocked from even getting a vote under the current Senate rules. So let's unpack this. Let's understand what this means. Right now, under our rules, it's possible for 41 senators representing 21 states and 11% of the United States population to block the will of 50 senators representing 84% of the U.S. population. Think about that. Under our current rules, senators representing a small percentage of the population, 11%, can block the will of the majority. So how did this happen? Well, it happened because over time, not at the beginning, but over time, senators decided to empower themselves at the expense of the American people. It wasn't always this way. As I said, in its earliest days, the Senate was founded on two principles. The first was that senators would have ample opportunity to make their case to their fellow senators and to the country. If they had the minority position on a particular issue, they had a chance to come here to the floor of the Senate to persuade their colleagues of the merits of their position. And maybe in the process, have the whole country turn to their side of the debate and influence the ultimate result. So the senators were given the opportunity for prolonged debate to ensure that all opinions were heard and considered before the final vote. In fact, as my colleague from Oregon mentioned, each senator was able to deliver 2 speeches on a particular question on a single legislative day. But after all the views were heard, after prolonged debate was ended, the Senate would move to a majority vote. That is how the Senate earned its reputation as the world's greatest deliberative body. Nothing could be further from the truth, that truth today. We have very little debate on the Senate floor today, real debate where senators engage on the big questions of the day. In fact, the minority of senators who oppose legislation pending before the Senate can block it without even coming to the Senate floor to debate. They don't even have to come here to make their case to their fellow senators or the American people. Don't even have to show up to debate. We're talking about a Senate rule that was designed to encourage debate, and yet we have it operating today where nobody has to even show up on this floor to make their position known. And it's not that senators don't even have to show up to debate. They don't even have to show up for the debate, for the vote to cut off debate. Under our current rules, we could have a vote right here in the Senate of 59-0 in favor of moving forward on legislation, and the 41 senators who didn't even show up would carry the day. They would block the 59 from expressing the will of the American people. How crazy is that? That's what the current Senate rules provide. Mr. President, that is not what the founders of our republic envisioned. In fact, the current version and application of the Senate's rules amount to a total perversion of the constitutional framework. These rules pervert the intent of our framers, and they undermine the democratic architecture of our republic. Our founders never intended for a minority of senators, for 41 senators, to be able to thwart the will of the majority and of the people. In Federalist 22, Alexander Hamilton asserted that the fundamental maxim of Republican government was, quote, the sense of the majority should prevail, unquote. And even more clearly right on point was James Madison in Federalist 58, where he directly warned against requiring more than a majority for a decision in the legislature, saying, quote, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed. It would be no longer the majority that would rule, the power would be transferred to the minority, unquote. This is James Madison, key architect of our Constitution and the framework of this republic. Now, Mr. President, we know it's true that the framers of our Constitution knew the dangers of overly powerful majorities. And they wanted to and did guard against that risk in the Constitution itself. That's why the framers diffused power among the people, among the states, and within the federal government to protect minority viewpoints in the country. In the Bill of Rights, our founders clearly said that each American has certain unalienable rights that no government action can take away, not by a vote of this Congress, not by an order of the President, not by anybody in the executive branch. That's the Bill of Rights. Our founders also created 3 co-equal branches of government, constrained by a system of checks and balances. It's all right here in the Constitution. And within the legislative branch, they didn't create one unitary body like most parliaments today. They created 2 separate bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and a totally independent executive branch with the president directly elected by the people through the Electoral College. Now, Mr. President, I think it's worth pointing out that the Senate contains built-in protections for the minority by its very structure. The 2 senators from Wyoming represent 578,000 of our fellow Americans. The 2 senators from California represent 39 million of our fellow Americans. 2 senators from Wyoming represent 578,000 people. 2 senators from California represent 39 million Americans. But here in the Senate, each of those senators, whether from Wyoming or California, have votes of equal weight. We can do the math, the political math. People of Wyoming are already exerting influence here in the Senate way out of proportion to their share of the American population. That's in the structure. But if you layer the current version of the Senate filibuster rule on top of the Senate structure and on top of the other protections for minority rights enshrined in our Constitution, you further nullify the will of the American people. You nullify the will of the majority of our fellow citizens. That's why the anti-majoritarian, anti-democratic small d Senate rule is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. You can search high and low, it's nowhere to be found here. In fact, as I said, our founders were very clear about allowing the majority sentiment and vote to prevail in the end. And they were very clear in this document, the Constitution, exactly when to require a supermajority vote. It's right here. 2/3 vote of all members is required to convict and remove a president. A 2/3 vote is needed to expel a senator. 2/3 needed to override a presidential veto. 2/3 vote to concur on treaties. 2/3 to amend the Constitution. That's it. That's what's in the Constitution of the United States. Our founders did not envision a Senate where the normal course of legislative process and business could be permanently blocked. by a minority of senators. There's nothing in here about needing 60 out of 100 votes to pass legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act. There's nothing in our Constitution about a Senate where 41 out of 100 senators can routinely block the will of the majority and subvert the will of the American people. James Madison expressly warned against requiring supermajorities for legislation. Yes for treaties. Yes for removal of a president. Not for the normal course of legislation. So where did the current Senate rule come from? It is a total invention of senators that empowers individual senators by disempowering the overwhelming majority of the American people. That's what it is. Think about this in the context of the Freedom to Vote Act. The duly elected President of the United States won over 80 million votes, won the Electoral College, is in favor of it. A majority of the House of Representatives, representing the majority of the American people, is in favor of it. 50 United States senators representing 62% of the American people are in favor of it. But the bill is being blocked by a minority of senators representing a minority of the American people. And think about this, Mr. President. State legislatures around the country, as we gather here, are passing laws to erect barriers to voting by a majority vote. The laws they are passing impact every citizen in this country because they impact the outcome of federal elections. When state legislatures in Georgia pass laws to disenfranchise voters in federal elections, they are disenfranchising voters in all of the other 49 states who have a stake in the outcome of federal elections. But the current version of the Senate rules prevent the United States Senate from casting a majority vote to protect voting for every American, even though the Constitution expressly empowers us to do that, to regulate federal elections. So, Mr. President, what arguments do proponents of the current filibuster rule present to justify this self-anointed power to thwart the majority will of the American people? One claim is that it promotes bipartisanship. Look, I know, Mr. President, I know the senator from Virginia who has joined us, I know the senator from Oregon. All of us prefer to find common ground to meet the challenges of the day when we can. I am proud to be the author of many bipartisan measures and to sponsor many others and to vote for many of those measures. But let's not kid ourselves here in the United States Senate about the ability of the 60 vote requirement to promote bipartisanship. The Senate we are living in today is the most polarized ever. The claim that this rule promotes bipartisanship flies in the face of the reality we witness every day. In fact, the filibuster in its current form has become a partisan political weapon. Tim Lau of the Brennan Center notes that while there have been more than 2,000 filibusters since 1917, about half of them have been in just the past 12 years. Think about that. There were more filibusters in President Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and the end of the Reagan administration combined. This abuse has led to partisan gridlock, not bipartisan cooperation. But, Mr. President, let's talk about bipartisanship. We had hoped, that action to preserve our democracy would be a bipartisan endeavor. But that isn't where we are today, and that's not new. The battle to protect constitutional rights has been waged along party lines in the past. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to former slaves and guarantees equal protection of the law, was passed by Republicans in Congress with almost no bipartisan support. We salute them for that action. The 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote to all citizens of the United States, and it was passed by one party and one party alone. Those actions were taken by the old Republican Party that used to be the party of Lincoln. Should we have sacrificed those critical amendments at the altar of bipartisanship? Should we have said to them, don't pass them because no Democrats at that time support them? Of course not. We all strive for bipartisanship, but that goal should not stand in the way of legislative action, especially on issues central to protecting our democracy. Another argument often made, including by many of our Democratic colleagues, in favor of keeping the current version of the Senate rules and the supermajority requirement highlights the risk of giving up the, quote, protection of the filibuster on issues that Democrats hold dear and where Republicans hold a different position. If we eliminate the 60-vote threshold to pass policies that Republicans don't like, won't Republicans be able to use a majority vote to pass policies that Democrats don't like? That's true. That's the nature of democracy. That's what elections are for. Every 2 years for members of the House, every 6 years for the Senate, every 4 years for the president. The American people don't like a law that we've passed. They get to go to the ballot box to render a decision. That is the ultimate accountability in the system. And we should not be erecting artificial rules to protect ourselves from the majority views of the American people. In fact, it's simply arrogant to invent a rule that blocks the will of the American people. It's simply arrogant to say that we senators, not we the people, are the guardians of our democracy. And we're going to come up with this rule that's not in the Constitution to do that. That's what our current Senate rules do. Now, Mr. President, there is one major exception to the 60-vote rule to end the filibuster on legislation. It's called the reconciliation process. I believe that this major exception exposes the absurdity of the current Senate rule itself. Most folks watching this debate may be justifiably confused. They're watching the Senate and they're saying, God, it was about a year ago that the Senate passed the American Rescue Plan with a majority vote. It was a vote of 50 to 49. It was a major piece of legislation responding to the pandemic emergency. Not a single Republican senator voted for it, but it passed. During the Trump administration, Senate Republicans passed a major tax giveaway to the rich by a vote of 51 to 48. Not a single Democrat voted for it. Those laws contain major policy changes, but they could not be blocked by a vote of a minority of 41 senators. Why is that? It's because in 1974, the Senate carved out a major exception to the supermajority filibuster rule for legislation connected to the annual budget process. That carve-out, that procedure, allowed for the passage of the Trump tax law, for the American Rescue Plan, and earlier for the Affordable Care Act. So, colleagues, here we are maintaining this carve-out to the filibuster rule that allows Donald Trump and Senate Republicans to pass big tax cuts by a majority party line vote. You can't block it with a vote of 41. It allows us to pass important things like the American Rescue Plan using the same procedure, but our rules don't allow us to pass bills to protect our democracy. That's absurd. Anyone paying close attention to the rules would see how absurd that is in a great democracy. And it needs to change, and it needs to change now. Each day that we maintain the current undemocratic Senate rules that allows 41 senators to block the will of the majority, we allow state legislatures to continue their assault on democracy. And we prevent our own democracy from working the way it was intended. Mr. President, the American people sent us here to get things done, to move the country forward, and the overwhelming majority of them are crying out for us to protect the future of our democracy. That's why we must amend the undemocratic rule that empowers 41 of 100 senators to disempower the majority of the people in our country. And I support the proposals put forward by our colleague from Oregon, Senator Merkley, that takes us back to the original design and intent of the first Senate and the framers. Debate. Everyone gets a chance to make their point. Convince your colleagues, convince the American people. But as James Madison said, at the end of the day, a great democracy must have a majority rule subject to the conditions already applied and set out in our Constitution. So I urge my colleagues to join us in restoring the Senate to its original purpose and then to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, including the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, to protect our democracy. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I gave a long speech.
To the senator, we are in a quorum
Oh,
call.
thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, last week I gave a long, detailed speech on the topic that was at hand last week, and it's the topic right now that we're focusing on here in the United States Senate. Voting rights and the majority leader's goal this week, as it was last week, to blow up the legislative filibuster. I believe it'll be the first time in U.S. history that a majority leader actually sought to do this, to blow up the legislative filibuster, which in and of itself says a lot. This would, of course, change the Senate, change the country forever. A lot of speeches on that. There will be many more speeches today, tomorrow, Thursday on these important topics. Now, the President of the United States weighed in on these two topics, the filibuster and voting rights, in Georgia, in a speech last week that, Mr. President, is already going down as an infamous speech by a President of the United States. Let's just say it didn't really go very well, the President's speech. I ask all Americans to take a look at it. It's quite disturbing for a whole host of reasons. The President's speech was almost universally panned, on the left even, on the right, in the center. I have not seen one U.S. senator come down on the floor this week to defend it. It'll be interesting as we debate these issues, if anyone does, but I doubt there will be. And there are many reasons for this. As a speech by a president, it was remarkably divisive. In essence, calling every senator, Democrat or Republican, who doesn't agree with him a racist and a traitor. Read the speech. It was historically absurd, invoking the sacrifices of the Civil War and heroes like Abraham Lincoln and villains like Jefferson Davis to present-day circumstances. It was profoundly unpresidential, as Senator McConnell stated, rhetoric completely unbecoming of a president of the United States, and as an attempt to get senators, especially Democrat senators, to vote the way in which President Biden wants them to vote. It appears to have been a monumental failure. Now, I wonder why, Mr. President. Well, of course, here's why. Calling someone a racist and traitor is not the normal, logical route to try to persuade one to come over to your side. And neither, Mr. President, is claiming that Republican senators and Republican legislators in states and Republican state voting laws are so-called Jim Crow 2.0. When your very own state's laws, in terms of voting, are some of the most restrictive in the country. This is a narrative I hope our friends in the media will keep an eye on during the debates this week. What am I talking about, Mr. President? Well, first and foremost, I'm talking about Majority Leader Schumer and Joe Biden and their states, New York and Delaware, which have some of the most restrictive voting laws in America. Let me repeat that. Some of the most restrictive voting laws in America come from the majority leader state and the President of the United States state. And yet, listen to their rhetoric. Listen to their rhetoric. Republicans in Republican states are, quote, Jim Crow 2.0. Mr. President, I was on the floor last week talking in particular detail about my state's laws. And we're all different states here, but I know my state's laws. I know them well as it relates to voting rights. And here's one thing I said last week. in some of the most critical issues in terms of voting rights legislation: early in-person voting, automatic voter registration, and this chart here, no excuse absentee voting. The Republican state of Alaska, the great state of Alaska, has voting laws that are significantly more expansive than the laws of New York, than the laws of Delaware, than the laws of Connecticut, than the laws of Massachusetts, and the laws of New Hampshire. It is a long list, Mr. President, a long list. And you can see why senators like me, my constituents in particular, find it more than just a little bit annoying when you have these smug arguments of Republican states being Jim Crow 2.0. Let me give you another particular one as it relates to New York, the majority leader's home state. My state has no excuse absentee voting. We've had that for many, many years. Many years. Now, the state of New York just had a statewide referendum to have same-day voter registration and no excuse absentee voting to meet the high standards that we have in Alaska. Now, the people in New York recently rejected that. I don't know why. I'm not from New York. I'm sure they had what they thought were good reasons to do that. But if the majority leader keeps coming down calling Republican states that restrict voting Jim Crow 2.0, is he going to go to Times Square and call his own constituents Jim Crow 2.0 relative to my great state? Because they just rejected doing this, restricting voting rights, according to the logic of the majority leader and the President of the United States. There's something really wrong here, Mr. President, on these arguments. And it's not just New York, and it's not just me making these arguments about where other states are. And again, my argument here is not to say, well, everybody should be like Alaska. In the Constitution, the founders gave the states the fundamental right and obligation and responsibility to design their state's laws in terms of voting. But what is really difficult to swallow is that so many of the arguments we're going to hear this week, and we heard last week, and we heard from the President of the United States, come from elected officials, U.S. senators, and the President, a former senator, who come from states who have some of the most least restrictive voting laws in the country. And again, Mr. President, it's not just me making this argument. This is an article, Mr. President, I submitted for the record last week from the Atlantic magazine. The Atlantic magazine, not a Republican mouthpiece by any measure. I'm going to read extensively from this article. Came out last year because it really makes the point I'm trying to make. Quote, Biden has assailed Georgia's new voting law as an atrocity akin to Jim Crow in the 21st century for the impact it could have on black citizens. But even once the GOP-passed measure takes effect, Georgia citizens will have far more opportunities to vote before Election Day than their counterparts in the president's home state, where 1 in 3 residents is black or Latino. To Republicans, Biden's criticism of the Georgia law smacks of hypocrisy. They have a point, says Dwayne Bensing, a voting rights advocate with Delaware's ACLU affiliate. The state is playing catch-up, the state of Delaware, in a lot of ways. The article goes on, Mr. President. Quote, Delaware isn't an anomaly among Democrat state strongholds. And its example presents the president's party with an uncomfortable reminder. Although Democrats like to call out Republicans for trying to suppress voting, the states they control in the Northeast make casting a ballot more difficult than anywhere else. Mr. President, I'm going to read that again. I'm going to read that again. Because it's an issue that no one's talking about. And it really smacks of hypocrisy when I see some of my colleagues down here making these great arguments about Jim Crow 2.0 in Republican states. Here it is again. The Atlantic. Quote, Delaware isn't an anomaly among Democrat strongholds, Democratic state strongholds. And its example presents the president's party with an uncomfortable reminder. Although Democrats like to call out Republicans for trying to suppress voting, the states they control in the Northeast make casting a ballot more difficult than anywhere else, unquote. Then the article goes on to say, quote, Connecticut has no early voting at all. Holy cow, my state has early voting. We've had it for years. And New York's onerous rules force voters to change their registration months in advance if they want to participate in a party primary. And by the way, New York just rejected what Alaska has. Jim Crow 2.0 in New York, who knows? Maybe, according to the president's logic. The article goes on. In Rhode Island, Democrats enacted a decade ago the kind of photo ID law that the Democratic Party has labeled, quote, racist when drafted by Republicans. A little bit of hypocrisy there. Article goes on. The state, Rhode Island, also requires voters to get the signatures of not one but two witnesses when casting an absentee ballot. Only Alabama and North Carolina are similarly strict. Article goes on. According to a new analysis released this week by the Nonpartisan Center for Election Innovation and Research, Delaware, Connecticut, and New York rank in the bottom thirds of states in their access to early and mail-in balloting. And as I just said, New York just rejected it again. Really wonder if the majority leader is going to come down and call his citizens Jim Crow 2.0. Mr. President, it's a very important issue. And here's the bottom line. Before any of my Democratic colleagues come to the floor this week with their insults, with their smug, offensive, inaccurate arguments about Jim Crow 2.0, racist traitors, mimicking the President of the United States last week in Georgia, I want my colleagues to come and answer this simple question, a very simple question. Why should we listen to you? Why should any American take you seriously when so many of you come from states with the most restrictive voting laws in America? I wonder if any of my colleagues are going to come down to the floor, particularly those like the majority leader, who love to rant about Jim Crow 2.0, when their states are leading the charge in America on restrictive voting. I yield the floor.
Majority Whip.
Past weekend, and yesterday particularly, we celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's likely that if you attended any event in that celebration, you heard at least part of his I Have a Dream speech. Many of us in the chamber happily quoted it because of our respect for him and the eloquence of his language in that moment. We like to remember the hopeful second half of that speech as well, because Dr. King imagines a future in which black children and white children play together, and all people are judged, as he so famously said, not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. However, many often forget or worse ignore the first half of the speech, in which Dr. King noted the painful irony that 100 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the, quote, promissory note of our Constitution and Declaration of Independence for Black Americans, he said simply, it's become a bad check, which has come back marked insufficient funds. An earlier generation of Republicans and Democratic senators had the courage and the conscience to face and begin to change that shameful act. It was here on the floor of this chamber in 1965 that the United States Senate voted 77-19 to pass the Voting Rights Act, outlawing state practices that denied millions of Americans, particularly black Americans, the right to vote. It is worth noting that it was a strong bipartisan vote and that percentage-wise, a greater number of Republicans than Democrats voted in support of it. The white Democrats from the South were notorious at that time for opposing it and opposing the civil rights movement. Well, over the next nearly 50 years, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 5 times, and that bipartisanship continued during the entire period. Each new version of the Voting Rights Act renewed the promise and the protections of that law, and each reauthorization was signed into law by a Republican president. Sadly, in more recent years, things have changed in an awful way. We have witnessed a sustained effort to chip away the protections guaranteed to every American under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mr. President, I grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois, and a trip to St. Louis was a big deal. And I can remember my mother, who was an immigrant to this country, had only an 8th grade education, though she had self-taught herself into a much higher level of learning. But I can remember my mother always pointing out the St. Louis courthouse to me. If you're familiar with the terrain, the arch wasn't there when I was growing up, but where that arch is today, just behind it, is this famous St. Louis courthouse. And we'd be driving over the Eads Bridge, and she'd say to me, now you see that St. Louis courthouse up there? That big white building, you see it? And you see all those steps that you can see from here? Yes? They used to sell slaves on those steps. I found it incredible that my mom would say that. She was not a historian, or as I mentioned, formally educated, but she knew that, and she knew that was the significance of that building. It was also the courthouse where the Dred Scott decision was argued. I say that because the Dred Scott decision, that infamous decision handed down in 1857, may have been the tipping point when it came to our Civil War. A decision by that court, now viewed as nothing short of outrageous, basically ruled that enslaved people, regardless of where they lived in the United States, could never be treated as American citizens and had no right to sue in the federal courts of America. Despite state decisions to have free states and slave states, despite the Missouri Compromise, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision basically came down clearly on the side of enslavement and said that for example, the Missouri court doctrine of once free, always free did not help Harriet and Dred Scott, who had had the good fortune to live in free states as part of their lives. That decision by the Supreme Court was a seminal decision in the history of our country. It's often noted the role that it played in the events that transpired afterwards. I think of that decision when I think of what has happened in recent years in the Supreme Court. 9 years ago, in 2013, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Shelby County versus Holder. That Supreme Court decision essentially nullified a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. Prior to the court's ruling in Shelby County, Section 5 required that localities with a track record of disenfranchising voters of color through tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests would have to seek federal approval for any changes they made to their voting rules. That requirement is known as pre-clearance, and it could have, I believe it would have, prevented many of the restrictive voting provisions being enacted in states like Georgia and Texas today. Just this past summer, the Supreme Court weakened another key section of the Voting Rights Act with its decision in Brnovich versus DNC. With these distorted rulings, the Supreme Court has fueled state-led efforts to suppress voters, particularly voters of color. In fact, Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan wrote in her dissent to Brnovich, quote, "In the last decade, this court has treated no statute worse than the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mr. President, you know what has happened across the United States in 19 different states. I think because of decisions like Shelby and Brnovich, these states have been emboldened. They don't believe that they're going to be held accountable for decisions they're making that restrict the right to vote the way they would have been before those decisions. And those who come to the defense of those states and their practices come to the floor of the Senate and predictably argue states' rights. States' rights. I heard it over the weekend on some of the talk shows. I don't know if there's a copy in here. Well, there is. I was hoping there'd be a copy of the Constitution in this desk I'm visiting. But Article 1, Section 4 of our Constitution is explicit for those who question whether or not it is the exclusive province of the states to establish standards for elections. And I'm going to read it. Section 4, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. And of course then the amendments following the Civil War, during and following the Civil War, went even further in terms of voting and the issue of race. It's very clear to me, and you only have to read those simple words, straightforward and direct in the Constitution, to realize that establishing standards for elections is not exclusively within the province of the state. In fact, just the opposite is true. When it comes to federal elections for representatives and senators, authority is given to us, this Senate and the House of Representatives, and of course, through the signature of the President, the law is created that can establish standards and regulations. And yet, members on the other side, members on the side of President Lincoln's political party, the Republican Party, now come to us at this moment in history and argue nullification and states' rights. What a cruel twist of fate that Mr. Lincoln's party, which took such pride in the progress that was made after that deadly Civil War in establishing civil rights, is now defending, almost to a person, the activities of 19 different states that restrict voting rights. Today, our democracy needs the Voting Rights Act of 1965 restored to its full power and potential. In the past year alone, Republican legislators in 19 states have enacted laws making it harder for Americans to vote. In total, more than 440 bills with voting restrictions have been introduced in 49 states, and more are on the way as the 2022 state legislative session gets underway. These efforts represent the most coordinated assault on voting rights since the Voting Rights Act was first passed under President Lyndon Johnson. The most troubling of these bills, the ones that I find incredible, grant partisan actors the power to potentially meddle and interfere in election administration. Now, where could they possibly have come up with that idea? That if you lose an election, you would contact the election authorities and ask them to change the results for your favor? Where could they have come up with that idea or notion, that outrageous idea? Perhaps in the recording that we have of the conversation between the leading election officials and President Donald Trump after he lost the election in 2020. That's exactly what he set out to do. And now in 19 states, they are setting up a scenario for that same strategy and tactic to be followed if you're disappointed with the outcome of an election. Arkansas and Kansas have already passed laws that, according to experts from States United Democracy Center, Protect Democracy and Law Forward, could be used to shift the power to decide elections to partisan political actors. In those states, the voters won't have the last word. The Republican political leaders will. And legislators in other states have introduced troubling bills with similar implication. For instance, in the state of Arizona, state legislators introduced 3 separate bills that, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, quote, would have directly empowered partisan officials to reject or overturn election results. It is an incredible outcome. More traditional attacks on the right to vote include efforts in Michigan, for example, where a group of Republican lawmakers are attempting to bypass the state's governor, as well as the state's voters, to enact a measure restricting voting rights. And of course, in Texas, the state enacted a bill known as SB 1, which the Brennan Center called, quote, one of the harshest restrictive voting bills in the country. One of the most troubling provisions of the law will make it harder for voters living with disabilities to receive the accommodations and assistance they need to exercise their right to vote. The members of this Senate have a constitutional obligation to respond to these state voting laws. And that means ensuring that the constitutional right to vote is protected by federal law and fully enforceable. It also means establishing nationwide standards that ensure every eligible voter can participate in our democracy. These remedies and protections must be available in every state, red and blue, from New York to Arizona. Allow me to make one other point, Mr. President. I've heard my Republican colleagues make the argument, well, take a look at the states across the blue belt of America. States like Delaware and New York. They don't go as far as the law that's being suggested by you Democrats. For example, same-day registration for those who want to show up and establish their voter registration on the day of the election. This bill is going to require it. The state of New York doesn't have it. The state of Delaware doesn't have it. In fact, the state of Illinois doesn't have it either. Well, my message to them is good. Let them get it. It's a good, positive way to expand the opportunity to vote. Many states have done it for years without problems. Those who are lagging, whether they're red or blue, should come into the 21st century. It should be our mission, our singular mission before anything else, to make sure that every eligible American has the right to vote, that we eliminate the burdens and obstacles, the tricks and traps that have been set up in all these states to make it so difficult. And we ought to be singularly embarrassed as a nation as we look at the film and all the videos and all the programs on Election Day that show African Americans standing in line hour after weary hour to exercise their right to vote, while many white voters just scoot through in the same localities in the same states. There's something fundamentally wrong here, and it's not just an accident. Last year, I joined with a bipartisan group of our colleagues to introduce the updated John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This legislation would restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. And truthfully, this should once again be a bipartisan, unifying endeavor. It hasn't been that long ago that Republicans and Democrats stood together and agreed that this was the right thing to do, to make sure that there was no discrimination against American voters. The last time we did this was 6 years ago, in 2006, and on a nearly unanimous basis. One of the Republicans who voted, I said 6 years ago, it's 16 years ago, one of the Republicans who voted in support of it was the senior senator from Kentucky, now the Republican leader, who said at that time when he voted for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006, quote, "This is a piece of legislation that has worked," close quote. Well, let's make sure it can keep working. I hope that my colleagues will come together in a bipartisan fashion and join us in supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, as well as Freedom to Vote Act. Join us in defending American democracy. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask that quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was out here a little while ago talking about why it's so important for us to move forward and vote on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and to uphold the voting rights of American citizens, something I feel very strongly about. I've had the good fortune to be in the United States Senate since the year 2000, and I got here, I should say the election was in 2000, took the oath of office in 2001. I got here in an election that was decided by 2,229 votes. It took 3 weeks to decide the election. It took recounts, it took verification by counties, and yes, the vote by mail system, which was pretty much the majority of votes at that point in time. Not everybody voted that way, but a big portion of votes at that time was a system that was starting to flourish in our state. And when I think about the year 2000 and the close election, I give thanks to my predecessor, Slade Gorton, for, even though it was a close election, not contesting the election. If people remember, that was the same year that there was such a close election that people considered what was the outcome in Florida. And yet Al Gore conceded the election to George Bush. My point is that where have we gotten to today? Because all of those people, George Bush, Al Gore, me, Slade Gorton, even though we had close elections, we had confidence in the outcome of the election, and we moved forward. We moved forward so much, in fact, that when our country was attacked just a few months later, we all pulled together to work together to build a more secure nation. We didn't sit around and say, you know, Slade Gorton didn't sit around and say, oh, I lost by 2,229 votes. Al Gore didn't sit around and say, oh, he lost Florida by so many votes and the votes weren't counted. No, we moved our country forward, and here in the United States Senate, we even discussed voting rights, and we discussed our federal role, and we discussed what reforms we wanted to have in the system to build more confidence in our electoral system. We didn't disintegrate into voter suppression activities. Now, I can't say that there wasn't some, I now call it nostalgia. There were some who said, oh yeah, vote by mail, maybe we shouldn't have it. I remember one of our colleagues here on the Senate floor, he was saying, I so much like to go into the polling place. It's my patriotic duty. I like to sign my name. I like to get on with it. I don't want to get rid of that, and I don't like vote by mail. Well, myself and Senator Wyden, Senator Murray, and others successfully defended vote by mail, and we can see today where it has now been more embraced in the United States of America, and more than the nostalgia that my friend had. Trust me, I could say a lot of nostalgia about going into a voting place and voting. My childhood was spent getting the vote out, because that's what you did in my family. You spent the day getting the vote out. You helped. I remember one year I said to my father I'd missed too much school and I didn't want to miss any more school, and I had to go to school on election day. And he told me there was no greater education than getting the vote out, and that I was going to be doing that. So I can be nostalgic. But right now, I'm proud of the 84% turnout in the state of Washington in a presidential election year, thanks to vote by mail. And I'm proud that vote by mail, I think, is the antidote to the accusations that people have about a voting system that they think can be attacked by a foreign government or undermined in an electronic voting system. The fact that when you vote by mail, you sign your name, both on the registration form, sign your name on the mail-in ballot, rip off a tab, basically mail in that ballot, and you have proof that you voted. And your signature is the verification. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Your signature is the verification that that system works. So yes, I'm not very happy that we're here, because a lot of the tactics that we are hearing about around the United States of America is about limiting vote by mail. It's about trying to stop it or slow it down or raise accusations about how it doesn't work. And part of the initial establishment of preclearance in the United States in the '65 Voting Rights Act was about the great disparity that existed in the United States between states, that some states had very different turnouts than other states in a presidential election, maybe 20 or 30% different. And so people were starting to say, how are you affecting us if some states aren't really empowering their citizens to vote, and the consequences is suppressing voter activity? So I definitely believe in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I definitely believe that starting in 1965, we had disparity in states in the way they voted, and we did something about it. And we did something about it because people were being discriminated against, and that was the premise of the law. Stop the discrimination. Stop the discriminatory tactics that states were using to discriminate against people so that their votes couldn't be cast. And now we've updated that law many times over the last several decades in a bipartisan fashion, most of the time signed into law by Republican presidents. So I don't get the stumbling block here. I don't get the stumbling block why people won't come to the table and help us write the next version of the 1965 Civil Rights Act that is just called the 2022 Civil Rights Act. I don't get it. I don't get why people aren't coming to the table to do that. But I know this, that one of the big lies out there, the Republicans, I see my colleague was here from Alaska, and I do feel a great affinity. People may not understand the relationship between the state of Alaska and the state of Washington, but it's a very true affinity. We come from the same part of the world. Our economies are integrated. We have many people who live in both places. We share commonality of culture, of our environment. And my colleague from Alaska was here talking about their vote-by-mail system. And so the fact that people are telling lies and trying to suppress the vote by suppressing vote-by-mail or calling it fraudulent is very frustrating. It's very frustrating, and it's one of the reasons we should come together in a bipartisan way and support vote-by-mail. We should be empowering people, particularly in a pandemic, to cast a vote so that we know their vote is counted, so we can have confidence that we had an election and that the people spoke. But here we have Newt Gingrich, who has said numerous times now, the biggest way to expand voter fraud is to expand vote by mail. Now, he said that on Fox News. He said it's been quoted in the paper. He's not said it once. He said it several times. Or maybe they just keep doing the same clip over and over again. And then his next line, which I didn't put on a chart, is, and the Democrats want universal access to vote by mail. Well, not sure what's wrong with vote by mail. We're going to talk about that because I'm not sure what's wrong with vote by mail. Like, seriously, I've seen it over the 20 years I've been in office, expanded in our state and in Oregon, and now used as the majority of the way that people vote. And so I don't take kindly to his comments or to the former president's comments that somehow this is a fraudulent system. It's not. First of all, I've got a lot of charts here, Madam President, so you'll have to excuse us. First of all, when you get a voter registration form for vote by mail, it says right on the form, you must be a citizen of the United States of America to vote. You must be 18 years of old the next election, or 18 before the special election. That's what it says right on the form. There's no mistaking about it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You are going to sign your name and attest to these issues. In fact, the attestation basically says, knowingly providing false information about yourself or the qualifications for voter registration is a Class C felony, punishable by imprisonment or a fine up to $10,000 or both. That's a pretty hefty fine. That's a pretty serious issue. I don't think most people are going to say, oh, I want to help perpetrate voter fraud because I want to go to jail or I want to pay this fine. And the notion that somebody illegally in the United States is going to sign up for this, most of these people are just trying to earn an income and stay on a low profile. I don't think any of them, if you're an illegal immigrant and you sign up for vote by mail and you vote by mail, you will be deported. You'll be deported. So I don't think people are out there doing this voluntarily because they think this is some great way to game the system. In fact, the statistics that were just done by a major report shows that there's less than 1% of voter fraud in this system. It's not really this notion that the former president would like to perpetrate. Well, the biggest reason why vote by mail works is what's here, but you don't see it. I guess I should sign my name. Because right here, I declare the facts on this registration form are true. I'm a citizen of the United States. I live at this address for at least the last 30 days before the election which I'm going to vote in. I'm old enough to vote in that election, and I understand that under the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections, you can't currently be serving a sentence for a felony conviction or incarcerated for a federally or out-of-state federal conviction. Okay, right there, you have to sign your name right below that. So this attestation and requirement, oh, by the way, part of the requirement on the form that you get is you also have to put in your driver's license or an ID. Now, in many states, you're moving to this driver's license, enhanced driver's license requirement, which you have to prove you're a citizen of the United States. Not every application you get at a driver's license office, you have to prove that. But this is the information on your voter registration card that you have to prove that you're attesting to the fact that you are a citizen of the United States. It is information that can be searched. So now we come to the actual ballot. I don't know if we have a copy of the ballot here. Oh, well, we'll have to go grab one of those. But on your ballot, you do the same thing. You get a ballot. Your ballot has to have that signature on it. You vote who you say you're going to vote for. You put it in a privacy envelope. You stick it in another envelope, and you mail it in. So at the county auditor, they match that signature that you signed on your voter registration card with the signature on that ballot. And that is how they know you are who you say you are. Now, that's no different really from most of the way voting has worked in our country for decades. When you go into the polling place, they ask you for your name. You go to a book. If you've noticed, your name and address were there in a blank space, and they say, sign your name. Most Americans probably never noticed at the top of that page was also an attestation that said, if you're lying about who you are, yeah, you're going to pay a fine and you're going to jail. So when you went to a polling place and you signed your signature, they went back and saw if it was the signature that you had on your registration card. So vote by mail is replicating that same system. An application card matched to a signature on your ballot. And that is what happened. Now, that is not to say there isn't attempts at fraud. Not to say that there isn't attempts at monkey business, because there is. But it says the system is based on something that is safe and secure and can be validated. I'm going to shock some people, I'm sure, by saying this. But when I went to vote in the last election, somebody had requested several ballots in my name. Several ballots in my name. I'm sure it was ill intent. There was nothing good about it. And when I looked to see that they hadn't counted my ballot, even though I had voted very early in the process, I became alarmed and I called the auditor and said, why haven't you counted my ballot? And he said, several people have filed ballots under your name. I am sure ill intent and monkey business by somebody. So I decided I'm going down to the courthouse to see what this was all about. But by the time I got there, the auditor had sorted it out and said, I found the one signature that matches your signature, and we've counted your ballot. So they hadn't done that. They probably threw it in a pile. Oh, we got 10 ballots under this name, whatever it was. Why did that happen? I don't know. But I know the system worked because he pulled them all aside, and when he got to it, they matched my name with the ballot that existed. Now, for us in Washington, because we've had some very close elections, the vote-by-mail system has got a lot of scrutiny. It got a lot of scrutiny in a governor's race a few years after I got elected, and the race got down to several hundred votes, really. I think in the end it was several hundred votes. And, you know, we had people, you know, admitting that they had voted for dead spouses. We had all sorts of things at the end when people knew that the level of scrutiny. Most elections aren't that close. But when you're down to hundreds of votes and you know that there's going to be scrutiny, the system works. It doesn't mean there won't be a mistake somewhere and that you won't have to redo the count and find it. It doesn't mean that there's absolutely 0,000 fraud. It means that it's a system based on a safe and secure measure and that you can go back and check it. Now, I love our vote-by-mail system, and the voters are proving at 84% turnout in the last presidential election, and sometimes in off-year elections, we can get as high as a 70% turnout. So it's working in off-year elections. Who is not for empowerment and enfranchisement of people? Apparently Newt Gingrich isn't, because he thinks it's a mastermind theory or some scenario where he thinks we're going to try to take over the world, when in reality, I would just say it's the next phase of voting, particularly in an era of pandemic, and that we need to have our elections be more secure. I would say that if people are going to fool around and create distrust in your election system, having a system where you get to tear off a tab and keep it at home and know that your ballot was cast and know that you can count it and know that you can count it again. In my election, when I won by 2,229 votes, the tallies weren't the same each time. They weren't. It changed. It didn't mean they were wrong. It just meant that various mistakes were made, they verified their work, and they were corrected. But my predecessor did not undermine the United States democracy by claiming he lost. He didn't go out and try to pass voter suppression laws. He came back here and worked on the 9/11 Commission with all of us and tried to defend our country. But that's not where we are today. We're here with Mr. Trump, President Trump. And, Madam President, you know, on January 6th, I sat outside and listened to the president. I really thought, you know, I'm going to go in and give a speech that night. I had no idea what was going to happen to us. I thought I was just going to speak on the floor that night. I thought that was it. I had no idea that we were going to face an insurrection. So I was taking notes. I thought, I'm going to give this speech. Well, as it turned out, didn't get to give that speech. We had kind of a truncated session that night. We gave a few speeches, a few people talked, but we didn't give a big speech. So I've been waiting to give this speech for a long time. I've been waiting to repudiate what the president said at his rally for a long time. And the reason is because I cannot stand to have our election system, the basis of our democracy, the basis of our country, why we're the gold standard around the world. I'm not sure anybody should go on a codel anymore to witness an election in another country until we get our election system right here. What are you going to say when you get there? What are you going to say if you're going to go to another country and witness their election? We know how to do it in the United States, because right now we're not proving that. We're showing that we can't move forward on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But let's go over what President Trump said that night. Because President Trump claimed that, his first claim, that the Michigan Secretary of State flooded the state with unsolicited mail-in ballots sent to everybody on the rolls in direct violation of state law. That's what he said that's what he said. That's what he said at his rally. That's what he said, go down there, go down there. You know, there's moments in this craziness. There's moments in this craziness when you realize there are people who will stand up. And I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. But I was probably the last person to leave this chamber. And the parliamentarian refused to let anyone touch the ballots. Even though she could barely walk down the hall, even though she could barely carry all those supplies, she knew that allowing anybody else to touch those certifications of the election would give somebody the claim that somehow somebody had interfered. So people were doing their job. And in this case, the Secretary of State, in response to a 2018 vote by the people of Michigan, they approved, in a vote by the people, a no-excuse absentee voting law. That's what the people of Michigan voted for. So the Secretary of State sent out ballots. Some people didn't like that. Some people challenged it. And in September of 2020, the Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the decision that the Secretary of State, citing the Constitution and their authority over elections, that they had the authority to mail those ballots. The Supreme Court of Michigan didn't take up that case. They didn't refute it. So it's false. He's trying to say mail-in ballot applications were illegally sent. It's not true. The people voted for it. The Secretary of State did her job. The courts upheld it. He tried to say 17,000 ballots were cast by deceased voters. Okay, I mean, to say nothing of the fact that there are probably a lot of people with the name of John Brown in Michigan. Like, there's lots of people by the same name. But there is a system that uses the Social Security Administration to flag death of deceased voters. And ballots in this case who have died are not counted in the Michigan election. In the state of Washington, if you cast a ballot and you mailed it and you died 2 days later and the election's not till the next week, your vote counts. Now, you can't mail it, your spouse can't mail it after you die and say, my wife intended to vote for so-and-so. No, no, no. But once you vote, once you fill the ballot out, and you put it in the mailbox or a ballot box, your vote is good even if you die the next day. That's our state. In Michigan, no. So they did not do this. They did not have this claim that the president had. And then he claimed the turnout in Wayne County was 137% of registered voters, or 139%, somewhere in there. Also not true. In Wayne County, it was 61% of the vote of more than 1.4 million registered voters. So all that he said about Michigan that night was false. It was false. And the courts upheld it. And it was just a big lie. Let's go to the president's state. Let's go to Wisconsin. Trump claimed 170,000 absentee ballots were counted without a valid absentee ballot application. Now, the president knows that your state is infamous, famous, appreciated for same-day voting. And in Milwaukee and Dane counties, a total of 170,000 people did vote absentee ballot in person in the 2020 election. They filled out an absentee ballot application, located it on the envelope like I showed, and sent in the ballot. So they know who those people are. They know that they were legitimate voters. They didn't vote without an application. They filled out the application as well. So this, too, is part of the big lie. And then Trump claimed that 100,000 ballots were backdated by U.S. postal workers. That's what he claimed. The U.S. Postal Service Inspector General investigation to the allegations and all of the USPS workers and contractors refuted these allegations. There was no evidence. There was no evidence. There was no evidence that this occurred. And then the famous thing that the other side of the aisle constantly talks about, which I don't understand, ballot harvesting. They think that somehow this is going to lead to ballot harvesting. So Donald Trump claimed that Madison had 19,000 ballots were collected by human drop boxes. I don't even know what a human drop box is. I don't even know what he means by a human drop box, or operatives. Well, facing an influx, Madison and the city clerk held a pair of events in which people could go to a park and drop off their absentee ballots at stations set up and staffed by poll workers. What is wrong with us if we're trying to make it harder to vote in America? What is the premise? If the premise is you want to certify that people are actual citizens of the United States, great, we have a system. If you want to certify they live there, great, we have a system. We have a fine, we have a penalty, we have a way to investigate them, we have a way to catch fraud. So what is it? You just want to make it harder to vote? No, no, no. Democracies are about enfranchising the vote. It's a constant effort. The same things we did in 1920 don't apply in 2020. In 2020, it's an information age, and we had a pandemic. What is wrong with making the vote available to people? So the ballot harvesting that he claims did not happen. That's also part of his speech that night. He went on for 45 minutes. He went on for 45 minutes whipping people up to come down here and attack the Capitol based on these lies that weren't true. Big lies that weren't true. Then he went on to Georgia. He claimed over 10,000 ballots in Georgia were cast by individuals whose names and birth dates matched Georgia residents who died in 2020 prior to the election. He later revised that down. He was like, oh, wait, no, that's too high. He said it was 5,000. And the State of Election Board in Georgia conducted a comprehensive investigation of deceased voters submitting ballots and found 4 cases. 4 cases. 4 cases. Again, I don't know what Georgia's law is. I don't know if it's like Washington. I don't know if it's like Michigan's. I don't know what it's like, but they found 4 people. So it wasn't 5,000. It wasn't 10,000. Trump claimed that there were 66,000 people that were under the age of 18 who voted. I think this has gotten a lot of attention because I think there's been some public accounting of this in the press. I think the Secretary of State refuted this several times. But in general, the Secretary of State said that there were 0 individuals under the 18 who voted in the election based on a comparison of people who voted in the 2020 election in Georgia to their full birthdays. So that also was refuted. And then Trump claimed, I showed you that attestation on the Washington ballot, the certification that you have to sign, what it says. Can't vote if you're incarcerated or a felon. So Trump claimed that there were 2,500 ballots cast in Georgia by individual names and birth dates that match incarcerated felons in Georgia prison. So there was no mass incarcerated voting of felons. They did investigate and did find 74 potential felons who they think could have cast a ballot. And guess what happened? They pulled them, so they weren't counted. That's how the system works. That's how the system works. That's what you're supposed to do. That's why you have the system. So just like the other states, no, those voter claims were false. Okay, let's go to Arizona. Also another claim. He's made a lot of claims since then, but I'm just focusing on the ones mostly from that evening because that's what sent people down here, and now that's what sent us on where we are with candidates all across America pledging Trump-think to run for office, which is undermining our election system and undermining our democracy. And all I want is our colleagues to work together on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That's all I want. Like, this can't be more tumultuous than 1965. Well, I'm not saying that he isn't, the former president isn't stirring up a lot. He is, but I got to believe that we can work together. So he said 36,000 ballots were illegally cast by non-citizens. Madam President, why am I going through this? Because I get a little tired of everybody just saying, oh, the courts decided, he was wrong, the courts decided, he was wrong. No, no, no. People need to have faith in this system. We need to work to build faith in this system. We need to work in a bipartisan fashion to build faith in this system. And we need to stop the discrepancies between states. 2020 turnout in Washington for presidential, 84%. Alaska, 60%. West Virginia, 63%. Georgia, 66%.